Hi moms, it's Uncle Rick with the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club. I know you love to read to your kids, and they love being read to, and they learn so much. But mom's a busy lady, and unfortunately, it seems there's never enough time to satisfy all your young listeners. Well, Uncle Rick Audio is the solution. In the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club, you'll find an enormous collection of fascinating, entertaining, and educational audiobooks for children, read by yours truly. From biographies to historical fiction to adventure stories to books of the Bible, your kids will love Uncle Rick's informal, personal style of reading. And here's the best part. With a yearly membership, you now get unlimited access to all this for only $10 a month. Or if you'd like to try it out, we have a monthly option as well. So don't wait. After you listen to this episode of Moments with Marilyn, head on over to UncleRickAudios.com and start exploring the Wonderland today. That's UncleRickAudios.com. Uncle Rick's Club is a safe place for kids to learn, grow, and have fun.
Hi, welcome to Moments with Marilyn. I'm your host, Marilyn Boyer, the mom of 14 homeschool kids who love the Lord and love each other. I absolutely love encouraging young moms. It's my passion to teach you tips and tools to make your journey easier. Things I learned along the way that I would do again and things I wouldn't do again. Today, I want to talk a little bit about how to make your family love history. I love history because it's fascinating. I know it probably wasn't interesting for you in school. It wasn't for me either. I hated it. That's because of the way it was taught. They had us memorize a bunch of names, dates, events that just didn't seem important. There's nothing more boring than memorizing stuff you see no need for, just so you can pass a test and forget it. But history, as the saying goes, is His story. The story of what God has been about doing for several thousands of years. The clock of time has been ticking. History isn't a list of facts. It's a huge collection of adventures. Some are happy events, some tragedies, but all are exciting stories in the great catalog of human experience. But I think the key to making history interesting as it should be is to recognize that it is indeed a story or a collection of stories. Some are stories of great events that affected millions, such as a war. Some are stories of incidents in individual lives that went no further than one person or one family, yet were recorded to entertain and instruct those of us who would read them years and even centuries later. You know, it's not very motivating to memorize the dates of George Washington's birth or his presidency or battles and so on, but oh, to hear the experiences in his life that made him into the giant of a man that he was, and to read the many volumes that he wrote himself. They open a door to the mind of a central character in America's history, a man that we would otherwise know only as a name, a public career, and some dates. It's not nearly as exciting as the Battle of Monongahela, in which Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him and ended the battle with bullet fragments in his hair and 4 bullet holes in his coat, but not a scratch. Washington ascribed his miraculous survival to God's protection, giving us a moral lesson as well as a history lesson. Now, you can read his story in Amazing American Presidents. There's much more to it than that. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a minute, too. But there was a time when the teaching of history was approached biographically. To use Washington's time as an example, students used to read and discuss the founding of America from the viewpoints of Washington, Franklin, Madison, Adams, Hamilton, and many others who were in the middle of it. These men, like most of the founders, wrote volumes and volumes of information, which gives us a clear picture of what they and the times they lived in were really about. There are tons and tons of primary sources, as they're called, around still that are accessible. But if you get no deeper than a textbook of a historical event, person, or time period with your child, well, don't expect a historian to blossom. Do you want your kids to be a lover of history? Do you want your child to learn the great lessons that can be learned from the lives of thousands who have worked their way through the wilderness of life before us? Then find and read biographies, stories that are powerful. That's why I wrote What a Character series. These are readers that tell the true stories of men and women in history, Stories make learning interesting, and learning that is interesting is learning that sticks. So I wanted to give you a few examples in this podcast of individual people. I've told you about Jake DeShazer before. Let me tell you about Francis Marion from the War of Independence. The war was going poorly for the Americans in South Carolina. Francis Marion grew up in South Carolina. He knew all the swamps where he hunted and fished as a boy. He grew up in a Christian home, actually. His family had come to America to have religious freedom. He became a partisan leader, which meant he would hide in the woods and strike without warning and then flee back to the forests and the swamps. He gave so many surprise attacks on the British, they couldn't see where he was coming from. They were always on the alert, and they could never trap Marion's men. Once, Tarleton chased him 20 miles through the swamps, and he finally gave up and said, "The devil himself couldn't catch that old swamp fox," and the name stuck, the Swamp Fox. A British officer was on a prisoner exchange, and he was led blindfolded to Francis Marion's camp. Marion invited him to join them for supper. They had swamp water to drink. They had roasted sweet potatoes served on a plate that was a piece of bark from a tree. The officer said to Marion, "Is this your usual fare?" He said, "No, sir, it's more than usual today because you have been so kind as to favor us with your company." He was astonished. He said, "You and your men must be well paid for your service." He said, "Well paid? We are paid nothing." He said, "Then why do you do it?" Francis Marion said, "For the love of liberty." The officer finished his meal. He was led back to the British camp. He resigned his commission as a soldier and he went back to England. He was asked why. He said, "Sir, we are fighting men who are so consumed with their passion for independence that they are willing to live on roots and swamp water. No army will ever defeat them." Isn't that amazing? I recently did a Swamp Fox birthday party for a couple of my grandkids. We had 8 little boys, and I got them all coonskin caps, and we had swamp water to drink, which was chocolate milk. We had roasted possum, which was really roasted pork, and we had Johnny cakes to eat. But we tried to have the food that they would have had. Oh, we had sweet potatoes on bark. We got some bark out of the wood and we roasted sweet potatoes and they ate them off the bark. And I love using opportunities to have special parties for the grandkids to teach them history. And they love it. They absolutely love it. Okay, I wanted to tell you about one inventor, George Washington Carver. He was called God's plant doctor. He was born as a slave. His father died. His mother was captured by slave traders. He was sick and weakly, and he was raised by the Carvers who owned him. But they raised George as their son. He called the woman of the plantation Aunt Susan. And she taught Carver to read and to write. He loved learning and he loved nature. When he got a little older, he moved 10 miles away to go to school. And he met a kind black lady who he rented a room from. He called her Aunt Mariah. She taught him many things, and he paid for his room and board by working on her farm. George became a Christian at age 10. Let me just say, when I write these books, if I know when the person got saved, if I've got a testimony of when they were saved, I include that in the book. He kept studying plants and nature, and he found cures for plants, and neighbors came and brought him their plants and asked him advice. They named him the plant doctor. He was the first African American to attend Iowa State. He paid for his education by doing students' laundry. He got a master's degree by doing experiments on plant diseases and became known as a botanist. He was invited by Booker T. Washington to study at Tuskegee Institute, and he started to train former slaves and their children and give them an education. That was his passion. He set up a little laboratory. It was called God's Little Workshop, and he gave glory to God for what he learned about plants. He helped Southern farmers who were planting cotton and depleting the soil, he taught them to plant peanuts. And he figured out over 200 ways to use peanuts. It was amazing. Do you wish you could get even more helpful tips and parenting tools? Well, now you can when you subscribe to Moments with Marilyn off-week exclusives. With this reasonably priced monthly subscription, you'll be able to dive deeper with 2 extra episodes every month and become a VIP supporter of the show who keeps us on the air. Get back to Weekly Moments with Marilyn today by clicking on the off-week exclusives link at the top of the show notes or description. Okay, let me tell you about an extraordinary animal hero. There was Wojtek, the bear, who went to war. This was in Poland in World War II. Germany was attacking the Polish army, and the British joined the Polish army to fight. A little bear, black bear, was found. Its mother had been killed, so the soldiers adopted him and raised him, and he was tame. He would snuggle up at night with his buddy Peter, the man who had adopted him. He caught a German spy in the shower stalls, and he helped the men catch him. The spy gave up his plans of attack, and they had planned to attack the camp that night. So Wojtek capturing him saved the whole camp. At the Battle of Mount Cassino, the men had to carry heavy canisters of ammo up a tall mountain. They weighed 100 pounds, and it took 4 men to carry them up this really steep hill. They'd have to carry them up and stack them. Wojtek imitated the soldiers, so he was sitting in a tree watching the men, and he came down out of the tree and held out his arms. They said, he wants one of the cartons of ammo. So they placed it in his arms, and he carried it up the hill. He stacked it like the men were doing. He went back down, and he did that for the entire Battle of Mount Cassino. In all, 17,000 tons of ammo and 1,000 tons of food for the soldiers were carried up the hill during that battle. Finally, the British flag was raised, the battle was won, and Wojtek was promoted to corporal for his outstanding service. And I won't tell you the whole story, but he helped reunite Peter with his family who had been evacuated from Poland. They ended up living in Uganda, and you'll have to get the book to figure out how that happened. But at the end of the war, he was put in a zoo in England. They made a special, large, roomy, grassy enclosure with a covered den and rocks to climb and a pond to swim in. He was famous. He was visited by school children. The soldiers came back, and the zookeeper would let them in to wrestle with them. He was lauded as the hero bear. Okay, America's spies. Oh boy, which one do I tell you about? I'm going to tell you about the Ghost Army. I had never heard about this until just recently. In World War II, Hitler, as you know, was determined to take over the world. D-Day had just begun. Soldiers were landing in France. And a different type of spy work happened. The men trained for weeks. They were not soldiers. They were ordered to fight with inflatable tanks, guns, and planes made of rubber. Their mission was to fool the Germans to think that the main army was in a certain location, while the actual army was in another location. The Germans would move their troops in to attack the fake army, which gave the real army time to dig in and be ready for them. The Ghost Army consisted of trained painters, art people, designers, and a sound crew. They recorded the sounds of tanks moving in, of officers calling out orders, of bridges being built, of radio messages being sent. They made tracks in the dirt. They hung up clotheslines with clothes on them. They hung laundry. They put spent shell casings scattered around. The soldiers built campfires. They camouflaged their fake tanks and planes. Meanwhile, General Patton's army was moving troops in to surround the Germans, and it worked. 50,000 Germans were captured. The Ghost Army participated in 22 large-scale deceptions in Europe. They were instrumental in freeing Europe from Nazi tyranny. After the war, this is so interesting, the Ghost Army was not allowed to tell anyone what they did or even that they had existed as such. They were officially classified. It was classified info until the 1990s. It was top secret for 50 years. On February 1st, 2022, President Biden awarded the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor to the Ghost Army participants. Now, isn't that cool? I could tell you about Anna Strong, the petticoat spy who helped George Washington at Long Island, New York, but I don't have time to tell you about too many. Famous women. Sybil Ludington was a brave messenger in the War of Independence. She was 16 years old. Her father was a colonel in Danbury, Connecticut. When the British Army offered a reward for his capture, he was an aide-de-camp to General Washington. Sybil stood alert for her father's safety. The Colonel Ludington needed a rider to muster up his troops. They would let the troops go home to work their farms, but when they were needed for a battle, somebody needed to ride around to alert them to show up at a certain place. So they needed to defend Danbury from attack. His troops were doing the spring planting. Who would ride through the country and notify the men? It was a 40-mile ride, and it was so dangerous. Sybil volunteered. She knew the country. She rode through the country. She knocked on doors. She called men to arms. Her father was needed to organize the troops as they arrived. The troops were able to defeat the British in a 2-hour battle, and the enemy lost twice as many men. If you compare Sybil Ludington's ride to Paul Revere's ride, Sybil rode twice as far in the dark of night through driving rain, and she made the ride all by herself. And nobody really knows much about Sybil Ludington. Heroes of the War of Independence. Let me tell you about Reverend James Caldwell. This was again in the War of Independence. The British Army was crossing from New York to New Jersey. The New Jersey Regiment called Reverend Caldwell to be their chaplain. On Sundays, he would preach to his church. During the week, he would be in the Army collecting valuable information. He recruited 52 men from his congregation and 31 officers. He used his church as a hospital for wounded soldiers. He and his wife Hannah would attend to the wounded. When he preached, he had his Bible in front of him and a pistol next to his Bible. The British heard about him, and they offered a reward for his capture. In January 1780, the British burned his church. He was alerted to that the British were approaching, and he wanted to get his wife and children to safety before leaving. But his wife assured him the British wouldn't harm a wife and small children. He hadn't been gone long when she heard commotion. She took baby Maria to her room to pray for safety. When a red-coated soldier stuck his gun through her window, killing her as she was holding her baby. He set fire to the house. The housekeeper and neighbors rescued the other children. James heard what had happened that night. The whole community was aroused to fight the British. Neighbors took the children in. At the Battle of Springfield, soldiers ran out of wadding. Wadding was necessary to hold the musket balls in place in their guns. Reverend Caldwell ran into the church, grabbed Isaac Watts' hymnals, began tearing out the pages, and handed the paper out to the soldiers and said, "Give 'em Watts, boys, give 'em Watts." The Battle of Springfield was the last time the British invaded New Jersey. The New Jersey people praised Caldwell for the success of the battle. There was another preacher, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, and I don't have time to tell you about him, but his story is so exciting. Okay, I told you a little bit about George Washington. I want to tell you about Dwight Eisenhower. Not many people know, but he was a Christian. I called him the praying supreme commander. He grew up as a farm boy. When he was 13 years old, he fell and cut his leg. No big deal at first, but then it got infected. The doctor said blood poisoning had set in and that the leg must be amputated or he would die. Dwight said, "It's my leg." He was in pain. It was excruciating. Sometimes he lost consciousness. He made his older brother promise to stand guard and not allow the doctor to amputate. He said, I choose to place my trust in my Lord and Savior and trust Him to determine if I should live or die. Please, Edgar, don't let them cut off my leg. 15-year-old Edgar sat out in a chair outside of his room. His mother brought him meals. His mother and father knew that Dwight was old enough to make his own decision. Miraculously, after the second day, the swelling began to go down. The fever broke. The inflammation slowly disappeared. God preserved his life. He went on to West Point. He became the supreme commander in World War II. He oversaw the entire D-Day invasion. This was 40 years after the life and death decision with his leg. And Dwight was facing another life and death decision, which involved the lives of thousands. The weather was bad. The winds were high. The seas were choppy. If the invasion didn't happen now, the element of surprise would be lost. The invasion would be sure to fail. There was a small break in the weather, and Ike had to decide whether to go for it or abandon the mission. He got counsel from his men, but ultimately he took a walk on a lonely country road, and he pled with his Savior and his Lord for guidance and for strength. He knew that many lives depended on this decision. As he walked that road, it became clear to him what he must do. He returned to his men and said, "Gentlemen, I think we are ready to go ahead. May God be with us." The attack broke the Nazi control of Europe, and Ike went on to be elected President of the United States. He honored God with his entire life, and you don't read that in most history books. Heroes of early America. Peter Francisco. George Washington called him a one-man army. Pedro Francisco was born on an island in the Azores off the coast of Portugal. He didn't remember much because he was pretty young, but he remembered living in a mansion near the sea. One day when he was 5 years old, he was playing with his sister. Some men grabbed him and his sister. His sister finally broke away, but Peter was blindfolded, he was chained, and taken to the hold of a ship. He did not understand the language that the men spoke, and they didn't understand him. He was taken by ship to Virginia, and he was adopted by Patrick Henry's uncle, Judge Wilson. He was apprenticed as a blacksmith. By the time he was 15 years old, he stood 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 260 pounds, and he was incredibly strong. Peter developed a fierce sense of patriotism when trouble began brewing with England. He attended the Second Continental Congress with the judge and became friends with many important patriots such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry. He was inspired by Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, and he joined Washington's army. The judge had to have a special uniform sewn for Peter because of his giant size. Peter was only 16 years old at his first battle, the Battle of Brandywine. He became good friends with Lafayette. At the Battle of Germantown, Peter personally carried many wounded men to safety. His strength was invaluable in the attack on Fort Mifflin. He could round up and carry twice as many logs as the other soldiers. He became well known for his great strength and bravery. George Washington had a special sword made for Peter because he had broken one in battle. He always boosted the morale of his fellow soldiers. He accomplished many feats of bravery. One of these was finding no horses still alive to pull a cannon. He hitched himself up to the 1,100-pound weapon and carried it off to safety so it would not be used by the British. He was present at Yorktown. George Washington said, "Without him, we would have lost 2 crucial battles, perhaps the war, and with it our freedom." He was truly a one-man army. Now, isn't this cool? There's so many stories. I'll just tell you one more. Elizabeth Zane, the girl who saved Fort Henry. It was during the siege of Fort Henry. The British were attacking. The supply of powder was dangerously low. The women began casting bullets and loading rifles for the men. For 40 hours, 16-year-old Betty helped make bullets without sleep or rest. Her brother's house was 60 yards outside the fort. Someone must be sent to retrieve the powder stored there because they were about out. Betty Zane volunteered to go. She said she would rather die than remain there and do nothing. The heavy gate was opened and Betty ran with all her might. The Indians were too amazed to figure out what was happening. She sprang into her brother's house, grabbed the full keg, and ran like the speed of lightning as bullets flew all around her. The gate swung open and Betty stumbled into the arms of her friends. The men cried, "We have a heroine in the fort now, and we conquer or die." The warriors rushed on the fort, but they were met with shot and cannon. The following morning, 70 men arrived as reinforcements, and Fort Henry was saved, thanks to the bravery of that girl, 16-year-old girl. So I hope to see kids become engaged with history and inspired by it to live useful, productive lives. We strove to teach our kids to seek out opportunities to serve others, and teaching these stories is one way to help them catch that vision. I hope that kids who read these books get a fresh dose of patriotism, seeing what others have invested in the freedom they enjoy every day. It's a huge part of learning how to protect freedom if you understand what others did to obtain it. As they read about the lives of real people, they will learn many facts about history as a byproduct. When kids read about amazing feats men and women and animals accomplished, they'll be inspired to attempt great important things with their lives. We are here on earth to please God and to live for Him. Reading about these men and women helps to broaden our horizons and move kids out of a selfish mindset where they're focused on themselves. Instead, it helps them focus on others. And let me just say, Master Books has done an amazing job of adding images to enhance the story. I hope that you have found this helpful, and I hope that you will consider teaching your kids character and history through the true stories of others. Thanks for joining me today. We'll see you next week. There's one really important thing that you can do to help our podcast reach more people with biblically sound parenting and homeschooling advice, because there are so many struggling moms and overwhelmed parents out there. And that's to engage with our show on whatever platform you're on. You can do this if you're on YouTube by subscribing to the channel and liking the video, or the same thing if you watch on Facebook. If you're on a podcast platform like Apple or Spotify, leaving a 5-star review and hitting follow would be a huge help. And that ensures that new episodes show up in your feed every time, meaning a new episode will never slip you by. Your support today helps more moms find the podcast, and we really appreciate it. Thanks.